Of the father and the brothers, she was forced to be the wife. The cruel incest case of the Blackwood family in the U.S. This is a story you may never have heard, but one that profoundly marked the judicial and medical history of the United States in the 1970s. In the depths of the Appalachian Mountains, where the dense green of the trees hides secrets as old as the rocks themselves, the Blackwood family lived. To the rare visitors of the small community of Pine Hollow in western Virginia, this family seemed merely reserved and traditional. But a dark reality was hidden behind the wooden walls of that isolated cabin, a reality that would only come to light in 1978 when Margaret Blackwood, then 23, finally managed to escape the nightmare that was her own home. Known in the region as a man of few words, the patriarch Joseph Blackwood was born in 1931. After the death of his wife Ellen during the birth of his fifth son in 1962, Joseph gradually pushed the family away from any outside contact. Located more than 20 kilometers from the nearest town, the Blackwood property became practically inaccessible when Joseph began blocking access roads with fallen trees and makeshift fences. At that time, it was common for families to live in isolation in the mountains, following old traditions and distrusting strangers, explains local historian Robert Jenkins. But the Blackwood case surpassed all boundaries of what could be considered a simple reclusive lifestyle. Living on the property were Joseph, his three sons, Thomas, born in 1952, William, 1954, and James, 1958, and his two daughters, Margaret, 1955, and the youngest, Sarah, 1962. The oldest, Elizabeth, had died as a child from pneumonia without ever receiving proper medical treatment. The isolation was nearly total. The boys occasionally went to town to sell wood or trade animals for supplies, but the girls were never seen. The children did not attend school, which, while uncommon, was not illegal at the time due to Virginia's flexible homeschooling laws. What no one knew was that since the age of 13, Margaret had been forced by her father to assume the role of the family's wife. The horror began just a few months after her mother's death when Joseph declared that Margaret would now be the woman of the house. The Blackwood case is particularly disturbing because it represents an extreme form of social isolation combined with forced consanguineous practices, explains forensic psychology expert Dr. Helena Rodriguez. Joseph's absolute control over his children created a microcosm where his distorted rules became the only reality they knew. At 16, Margaret gave birth to her first child, a girl with serious congenital deformities who lived only 3 days. No one outside the family knew of this birth, and the infant was buried in a small makeshift cemetery at the back of the property. Between 1971 and 1978, Margaret would give birth to 5 more children. 2 of them survived, Robert, born in 1973, and Mary, born in 1975. Both displayed visible signs of genetic problems, including webbed fingers, compromised cognitive development, and, in Robert's case, severe facial malformation. The genetic consequences of consanguinity are well documented, explains geneticist Dr. Thomas Marshall of the University of Virginia. When close relatives have children, the risk of rare recessive diseases and congenital malformations increases dramatically. In the case of the Blackwood family, with multiple generations of consanguineous relationships, genetic problems were amplified to catastrophic levels. The situation deteriorated further when Sarah, the younger sister, began to show signs of puberty. Fearing the same fate, Margaret made the decision that would forever change the course of that story, to escape and seek help. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. These real stories of consanguinity reveal a dark side of society that few have the courage to confront, but we all need to know to protect the most vulnerable. Subscribe to continue your journey through these hidden truths that shape our understanding of the human condition. The night of October 17, 1978, was exceptionally cold when Margaret Blackwood, carrying her 2 young children, took advantage of everyone being asleep to escape the property. The escape had been meticulously planned for months. Margaret had kept small amounts of money she occasionally got from her brothers, gathered some clothes, and, most importantly, memorized the way to the main road. I remember that night as if it were yesterday, retired Sheriff Clyde Donovan would reveal years later. He was on duty when a disheveled woman with 2 children who appeared to have disabilities knocked on the door of the Pine Ridge police station at 4:30 a.m. She could barely speak. She was in a state of shock, malnourished, and with obvious signs of prolonged abuse. Margaret's initial account was so disturbing that Sheriff Donovan initially suspected he might be dealing with someone with mental problems, but the consistency of the details and the presence of children with obvious genetic issues convinced him to investigate. The children barely spoke, recalls nurse Janet Williams, who attended the family at the local hospital. The boy, Robert, had what would later be diagnosed as syndactyly, webbed fingers, and jaw problems that made it difficult to eat. The girl, Mary, had severe strabismus and showed clear signs of developmental delay. The revelation of Margaret's history triggered one of the largest police operations in the county's history. The next morning, a team of police officers accompanied by social workers went to the Blackwood property. What they found confirmed the nightmare Margaret had reported. The cabin, built by Joseph's grandfather decades earlier, was in deplorable condition. There was no electricity or running water. The interior revealed a primitive standard of living, with makeshift rooms separated only by torn curtains. In the back of the property, the officers found the small cemetery where Margaret's other children who had not survived were buried. Joseph and his 3 adult sons were arrested immediately. Sarah, then 16, was placed in state custody. Later medical examinations would reveal that she had also been a victim, being 2 months pregnant. The Blackwood case exposed a reality that many preferred to believe no longer existed in modern America, explained social historian Elizabeth Parker. Isolated communities in the Appalachian Mountains maintained 19th-century traditions and practices well into the 20th century, some of them including marriages between cousins and, in extreme cases like this, relationships between parents and children or siblings. The local press initially handled the story with discretion, but when details began to leak, it gained national prominence. Journalists from major media outlets converged on the small town, shocking local residents who were mostly unaware of the Blackwood family's existence. "We never imagined that something like this could happen so close," Pine Ridge Mayor Harold Johnson said at the time. "Those mountains hide many families that live on the fringes of society. But this is something we thought was possible only in medieval times." The medical examinations performed on Margaret, her children, and her sister Sarah revealed the devastating impact of years of consanguinity. In addition to visible malformations, the children had cardiac, immunological, and neurological problems. Sarah, despite being only 16, already showed signs of early osteoporosis and kidney issues. Prolonged consanguinity has cumulative effects through generations, explains Dr. Marshall. Each successive generation of consanguineous marriages increases the load of harmful genetic mutations, leading to a gradual collapse of physical and mental health. During the investigation, it was discovered that Joseph's own mother, Eliza Blackwood, was his first cousin. This pattern of cousin marriages had been common in the family for at least 4 generations, creating a genetically compromised pool even before the recent events. The case was beginning to reveal not just a family tragedy, but a broader social problem rooted in the geographical and cultural isolation of rural Appalachian communities. The trial of Joseph Blackwood and his 3 sons began in April 1979, attracting unprecedented national attention to the small county court. The prosecutor assigned to the case, Catherine Reynolds, a young lawyer determined to achieve justice, faced significant challenges. There were no clear precedents for a case of such magnitude, explains legal historian Paul Withers. Most cases of consanguineous relationships that reached the courts involved one perpetrator and one victim, not an entire family system built around this practice. The 4 men were charged with multiple crimes, including kidnapping, false imprisonment, and what was at the time classified as immoral relations within the family. Virginia's legislation had not yet modernized its legal language to deal with cases of forced incest. Margaret's testimony, which lasted 3 days, was considered by those present as one of the most disturbing moments in American judicial history. Speaking in a low, almost inaudible voice, she described how, at the age of 13, her father announced that she would replace her deceased mother, in all aspects. My father said that was how things were always done in the mountains, that it was our family's tradition, Margaret stated. He said the family's blood needed to be kept pure, that we couldn't trust strangers. At age 15, when Margaret tried to resist for the first time, Joseph locked her in the basement for weeks, feeding her just enough to keep her alive. It was during this time that her older brothers, Thomas and William, also began to treat her as a wife. The Blackwood case wasn't just about one wicked man, explains Dr. Rodriguez. It was about how extreme isolation can create micro-societies with their own rules, where behaviors that would be universally condemned become normalized within that small circle. Asterisk if you are watching this story and feel a mixture of horror and compassion for the Blackwood family tragedy, comment now. These mountains keep secrets that should never exist. Your comment helps warn more people about these hidden realities that we need to face collectively, asterisk. During the trial, genetics experts explained to the jury the devastating consequences of prolonged consanguinity. Dr. Richard Collins, one of the country's first experts in forensic genetics, presented evidence that Margaret's children suffered from multiple rare genetic conditions that occur at a much higher rate in families with a history of consanguinity. The chances of some of the conditions observed in these children occurring naturally are approximately 1 in 500,000, stated Dr. Collins. In families with a history of close consanguinity over multiple generations, these chances increase to 1 in 50. The behavior of the accused during the trial only intensified the public's shock. Joseph Blackwood remained impassive, refusing to acknowledge the severity of his acts. In a particularly disturbing moment, he told the judge, "No one has the right to interfere with how a man rules his family." Thomas and William, the older brothers, seemed genuinely confused as to why they were being tried. James, the youngest brother, was the only one who showed signs of remorse, crying during Margaret's testimony. The most frightening aspect of the Blackwood case, says forensic psychologist Dr. Rodriguez, is how absolute isolation allowed a completely distorted worldview to become the only reality for those children. Joseph's children grew up believing their actions were normal, even traditional. In a surprising development during the trial, old records came to light suggesting that Joseph himself had been the product of a relationship between his father and his sister, a revelation that cast new light on the intergenerational cycle of consanguinity in the family. In extremely isolated communities, especially before the 1950s, it was not uncommon for patterns of consanguinity to be established and perpetuated for generations, explains cultural anthropologist Dr. Martha Stevens. These communities developed their own justifications, often mixing distorted interpretations of religious texts with oral traditions about the purity of family blood. The trial also exposed the failure of local authorities and social services. Although the Blackwood children had never attended school or received mandatory vaccines, no investigation had ever been carried out. An employee of the local social work department admitted that the family had been on a checklist for years, but due to a scarcity of personnel and the difficulty of accessing the property, the case was never properly investigated. The sentence, pronounced in July 1979, was historic. Joseph Blackwood was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. Thomas and William each received 45 years, while James, considered less culpable due to his father's influence, received 20 years. While the judicial case came to an end, the true battle for Margaret and her children was just beginning. Detailed medical examinations revealed the devastating extent of the genetic consequences of prolonged consanguinity. Robert, then 6, had not only visible physical malformations but also serious heart problems that would require multiple surgeries throughout his life. His immune system was so compromised that common infections represented potentially fatal threats. Mary, 4, suffered from a rare metabolic disease that affected her ability to process proteins, requiring an extremely restrictive diet. Her cognitive development was significantly delayed, and neurological examinations indicated structural abnormalities in her brain. The Blackwood case provided the medical community a unique opportunity to study the extreme effects of close consanguinity over multiple generations, explains geneticist Dr. Lawrence Peterson, who followed the case. The problems observed in the children went far beyond what we usually see in cases of first-generation consanguinity. Genetic analysis, still in its early days at the time, confirmed that both children carried multiple recessive genetic mutations that only manifested because they had received identical copies of defective genes from both their maternal and paternal sides, exactly the scenario that makes consanguineous relationships so problematic from a genetic standpoint. In normal populations, many of us carry one or two potentially harmful recessive genetic mutations, explains Dr. Peterson. But since our partners are unlikely to carry the same mutations, our children inherit only one copy and remain healthy. In consanguineous relationships, especially when repeated for generations, the likelihood of a child inheriting two identical copies of a defective gene increases dramatically. Sarah, Margaret's younger sister, faced her own tragedy. Her pregnancy, the result of a forced relationship with her father, presented severe complications. The baby, born prematurely in May 1979, lived only 2 days, suffering from multiple organ failures. Sarah's case represents the vicious cycle of consanguinity, says Dr. Rodriguez. She herself was already a product of a compromised genetic pool, and her son faced even greater genetic challenges. Legal intervention, as late as it was, at least interrupted this cycle. Margaret, Sarah, and the surviving children faced not only medical challenges but also social stigma. After the trial, the family was relocated to another state with new identities as part of a precursor program to what we now know as witness protection. The stigma associated with consanguinity is as old as civilization itself, explains anthropologist Dr. Richard Barnes. Virtually all cultures have developed taboos against close-kin relationships, partly due to an intuition about the genetic consequences, but also as a form of social organization. When extreme cases like the Blackwoods come to light, they often arouse a visceral revulsion. The Blackwood case also had significant political and social repercussions. In 1980, the Virginia legislature revised its laws on child abuse and consanguinity, creating more severe penalties and clearer procedures for intervention in suspected cases. Social services in various states enhanced their protocols to identify and monitor families in extreme isolation. Before the Blackwood case, there was a cultural reluctance to interfere with how traditional families organized themselves, especially in remote rural areas, explained social historian Parker. This case helped establish that certain practices are unacceptable regardless of cultural context or geographical location. Researchers also began to study the isolated communities of the Appalachians more systematically. They found that while the Blackwood case represented an extreme, marriages between first and second cousins were not uncommon in certain remote areas until the 1960s. Geographic isolation, poverty, and distrust of outsiders created conditions for certain communities to remain culturally segregated from the rest of society for generations, explains sociologist Dr. Michael Harris. In some of these social bubbles, practices that had been abandoned by the rest of society persisted well into the 20th century. The history of the Blackwoods became a case study not only for geneticists but also for social workers, psychologists, sociologists, and legal professionals, illustrating the extreme consequences of social isolation and consanguinity. 47 years after the discovery of the Blackwood case, the echoes of that dark story still resonate, both in the lives of the survivors and in American public policy and collective consciousness. Margaret Blackwood, who assumed a new identity after the trial, lived a discreet life in the Midwest. According to limited reports, she was able to obtain a basic education and worked for many years as an assistant in a municipal library. She never married again, dedicating her life to the care of her children. She died in 2017 at the age of 62 due to heart complications. Her son, Robert, faced numerous medical challenges throughout his life. He underwent 17 surgeries by adulthood, most to correct heart and orthopedic problems. Despite his physical and cognitive limitations, he achieved partial independence, working in protected jobs and living in an assisted community. In a rare anonymous interview with a researcher in 2005, he said, "I never met my father or uncles, and I'm grateful for that. The only family I ever needed was my mother." Mary, Margaret's daughter, had a more difficult path. Her neurological conditions severely limited her ability to develop independent life skills. She has lived in specialized institutions since adolescence and requires continuous care to this day. Sarah, Margaret's younger sister, may have achieved the most remarkable recovery. After years of intensive therapy, she completed high school and later college, becoming a social worker specializing in cases of child abuse. In occasional lectures, always using a pseudonym and altered appearance, she shares her experience to train professionals who work with abuse victims. Sarah's case represents the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit, says Dr. Rodriguez. Turning such deep trauma into motivation to help others is a healing path that few can walk. Joseph Blackwood died in prison in 1992 at the age of 61, without ever showing remorse for his actions. Thomas and William remain incarcerated, having had all their parole requests denied. James, who received the lighter sentence, was released in 1999 and lives under supervision in an undisclosed state, where he allegedly works as a mechanic and leads a solitary life. The site of the Blackwood property has been completely abandoned. The cabin was demolished, and the area has gradually been reclaimed by the forest. Few local residents can identify the exact place where the family lived, and the more superstitious avoid the area, claiming it carries a heavy energy. There is a natural human tendency to want to erase the physical traces of tragedies like this, explains Dr. Barnes. It's as if by removing the visible evidence, we could somehow eliminate the stain on the collective conscience of the community. The most lasting legacy of the Blackwood case, however, lies in the social and legal changes it triggered. More rigorous child abuse laws, increased resources for protection services in rural areas, and enhanced protocols to monitor families in extreme isolation have been implemented in several states. The Blackwood case represents a turning point in how American society views its collective responsibility for protecting children, says retired Judge Martha Collins, who has presided over several child abuse cases throughout her career. It forced us to recognize that even in a society that values family privacy, there are limits that cannot be crossed. From a scientific point of view, the case provided valuable insights into the effects of prolonged consanguinity on the human genome. DNA samples collected from all family members were preserved, and with the advancement of genetic sequencing technologies in the following decades, they continued to reveal new information about the genetic mechanisms involved. The Blackwood samples, as they are known in the scientific community, represent a unique record of the extreme effects of multigenerational consanguinity, explains Dr. Peterson. Each advancement in genomic technology allows us to extract new information from these samples, contributing to our understanding of rare genetic diseases. Perhaps the most important legacy of the case is educational. The history of the Blackwoods is studied in medical, law, social work, and psychology faculties as an extreme example of the consequences of social isolation and consanguinity. The value of this story lies in its power to warn of early warning signs, explains Dr. Stevens. No family reaches this extreme point overnight. There is always a gradual process of isolation, control, and normalization of abusive behaviors that, if identified early, can be interrupted. For the rural communities of the Appalachians, the case brought often unwanted scrutiny. Many residents of these areas were unfairly stigmatized, as if the extreme behavior of the Blackwoods were representative of their culture. It is important to distinguish between the natural geographical isolation of these communities and the pathological isolation imposed by individuals like Joseph Blackwood, emphasizes Dr. Harris. The vast majority of families living in remote areas maintain healthy connections with neighboring communities and adhere to fundamental social norms. If you've watched this far, it's because this story resonated with you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here, so I can get to know you and see who truly appreciates the stories here on the channel." Don't forget to like this video so more people can learn about these stories that need to be told, and share it with someone you believe should understand the dangers of extreme isolation and consanguinity. Subscribe to the channel to follow more real cases that reveal obscure aspects of human nature and help us protect the most vulnerable. The history of the Blackwoods remains a dark reminder of how extreme isolation, combined with cultural distortions and individual pathologies, can create environments where the unthinkable becomes reality. It is also a story of human resilience, demonstrating how even victims of the most terrible circumstances can, with proper support, rebuild their lives. In words attributed to Sarah Blackwood during one of her rare public appearances, "What happened in Pine Hollow was not our choice. But what we do with this experience now is." Every time a child is rescued from an abusive situation because someone recognized the warning signs, our story gains a new meaning. While the Appalachian Mountains continue to guard their secrets, the Blackwood case remains a reminder of our collective responsibility to protect the most vulnerable, even when, especially when, they are hidden from society's view.